Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. North Korea is continuing its missile testing spree, making threats against the U.S. and South Korea. Here in the United States, Americans cast their ballots in congressional elections that will shape U.S. domestic and foreign policy in the second half of President Biden's term. On the program today, we have Panetta, a former CIA director, Secretary of Defense, and White House Chief of Staff, plus a panel of experts.
The American people have made clear, I think, that they expect Republicans to be prepared to work with me as well. In the area of foreign policy,
Secretary Panetta, welcome to Washington Talk.
Good to be with you.
Secretary Panetta, in the recent U.S.-RK Security Consultative Meeting, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made clear any North Korean nuclear attack against the U.S. or its allies and partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of the Kim regime. Now, in 2017, you said, I think the North Koreans understand that if they take the wrong step, it's the end of the regime. So when you were the CIA director or when you were the Secretary of Defense, did you send a specific message to North Korea about ending that regime if it makes a wrong step?
In the conversations that we had with South Korea in discussing the situation with North Korea, it was made clear that if North Korea would do anything provocative, that it ultimately could cost Kim Jong-un the regime. Mm-hmm. And so the message was sent through channels that if, in fact, North Korea would ever use a nuclear weapon in any fashion, that would ultimately destroy the regime itself. Mm-hmm. So that is a very common message that I think has been sent to North Korea, but also has been understood in terms of what the consequences would be if Kim Jong-un did something that was provocative.
Mr. Secretary, that message was also in the latest nuclear posture review, and there are more frequent warnings coming out of the U.S. government about ending the North Korean regime. And in that regime, absolute power is in one leader. So, Secretary Panetta, does the CIA have a close surveillance on Kim Jong-un's every move?
Well, there's no question that with regards to all of our adversaries, we have to maintain the best intelligence we can. There are a lot of danger points in the world today. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, failed states in the Middle East, terrorism. There are a number of targets, but clearly for a regime like North Korea, where one leader makes the decisions as to what will or will not happen, it is very important that we have the very best intelligence possible on what that leader is up to. Now, having said that, North Korea has always been a very hard target to be able to penetrate. Because it is one leader who maintains extreme control at that level. And so it's not an easy target, but I would assume that our intelligence capabilities are doing everything necessary to make sure we have the latest intelligence on what they're up to.
Former Defense Secretary Esper told VOA last week that the redeployment of tactical U.S. nuclear weapons to South Korea shouldn't be off the table. Do you share the same view?
I do. I think that we ought to keep all options on the table, including the possibility of having the nuclear weapons located in a situation where it's very clear to North Korea that we have that capability on the peninsula.
North Korea is simulating tactical nuclear strikes on South Korea. So some people in South Korea say nuclear armament is the only answer, that they need nuclear parity. So do you agree with the sentiment there that South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons is a matter of sovereign decision?
Well, obviously, we respect the sovereignty of South Korea. They are a democracy. They have the ability to make decisions that they feel are necessary for their national security. But the most important thing right now in dealing with North Korea is that we maintain a strong alliance. United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, other countries that are part of our alliance are very important to our ability to send a message to North Korea that if they do anything provocative, that there is a strong alliance that will react against them. And so I believe that it's important for South Korea and the United States and Japan to have a strong working relationship and to make decisions as an alliance as to what would be in the best national security interest for all.
Mr. Secretary, in your memoir, Worthy Fights, released in 2014, you were briefed by USFK Commander Skip Sharp, who said if North Korea moved across the border, the U.S. war plans call for defending South Korea, including with nuclear weapons if necessary. Is it still the U.S. position to use nuclear weapons to protect South Korea?
Well, I haven't seen the latest plans, obviously, but that was certainly the case when I was Secretary of Defense, when I was Director of the CIA, that there was no question that if North Korea resorted to a nuclear weapon, that we would respond in kind. I would assume that that is certainly one of the options that's on the table for any kind of response to a North Korean attack. It would not only be provocative, it would be extremely dangerous in terms of the consequences to the Korean Peninsula.
Now, Mr. Secretary, if North Korea conduct attacks against South Korea, will the U.S. sacrifice one city to protect South Korea? There are differing views here.
I think the approach that we have always taken is that we will defend South Korea, period. And that we are prepared, working with the South Koreans, we have put together a very effective capability between the South Korean armed forces and the United States forces that are there in South Korea. We have the ability to strongly defend South Korea, all of South Korea, without having to sacrifice any one city. Obviously, as we deal with the potential of a North Korea invasion or attack on South Korea, we look at every possibility, every possible option that North Korea might try to employ, and we have a response for every one of those possibilities. So North Korea, I think, is aware of the fact that if they do something stupid, that ultimately it will cost them their regime.
Now, Mr. Secretary, you were White House Chief of Staff during the Clinton administration, and in 1993, the Clinton administration planned a surgical strike against North Korea's Yongbyon nuclear facility. In retrospect, do you think the U.S. should have carried out that strike before North Korea completed its nuclear development?
Well, again, that was something that was obviously in a planning stage. And I think the hope was that rather than having to conduct that strike, that ultimately we might be able to find an approach of negotiating our differences with North Korea so that we could avoid the use of that kind of force. I think it's clear that North Korea was going to proceed with the development of nuclear weapons no matter what. And that has been their approach because they believe that having nuclear weapons is what goes to their core strength in terms of preventing other countries from attacking North Korea. Having said that, I do believe that it is very important to make clear to North Korea that they cannot survive in the world without recognizing that they have to be able to control and reduce any kind of nuclear weapons that they possess.
Mr. Secretary, just shortly before I let you go, realistically speaking, is denuclearization a feasible goal under the Kim Jong-un regime?
I think denuclearization ought to remain our principal goal in dealing with North Korea. I think it's very important that we send a message to North Korea that our goal in dealing with them is to denuclearize North Korea and prevent the potential of a nuclear confrontation in the future. I recognize the fact that they now have a number of weapons. They also have a number of missiles. But if we're to proceed with some kind of negotiation in the future, that negotiation must be based on the fact that North Korea ultimately has to denuclearize and reduce and ultimately eliminate its nuclear weapons stockpile. That's the only goal that, to me, is required if we are going to be able to ultimately resolve our differences with North Korea. If they're going to become a partner in the international community, then they have to be able to recognize that they cannot continue to develop nuclear weapons and threaten their neighbors and threaten that region. That's unacceptable.
Secretary Panetta, thank you very much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And joining us for our panel discussion today, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also in the studio with me, Mr. Robert Rapson. Mr. Rapson served as a chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul until July 2021. He was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy Seoul. Mr. Rapson was also the Director for Korean Affairs at the State Department. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Secretary Panetta, who was also CIA Director, said that there's no question when it comes to our adversaries, we must keep the best intelligence we can. Now, U.S. Operation Neptune Spear took out Osama bin Laden in 2011 after CIA tracking him down for a decade. And then U.S. Operation Red Dawn captured Saddam Hussein. Mr. Klingner, you were with CIA for 2 decades. Do you envision similar operation against Kim Jong-un is a possibility?
I don't think so. Executive Order 12333 precludes assassinations against leaders of other countries unless we are in a time of war when they are considered a senior commander in the military. So unless we are at war with North Korea, that would not be a viable target. Also, I think beyond that, you just have to worry about the consequences of a failed attempt or even a successful attempt. What turmoil there would be in North Korea, who would have control of the nuclear weapons, who would be the next leader, et cetera. It could very well cause an explosion in the sense of an attack on the South or an implosion of this turmoil within North Korea.
So in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. was already in a war.
Correct.
Now, when it comes to South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons, Secretary Panetta said that it is a democratic country. It can make decisions that is necessary for its national defense, that we should respect South Korea's sovereignty. For now, when it comes to North Korea, maintaining strong alliance is the most important. That's what Secretary Panetta said. So if it is a democratic country, is it safer for that country to pursue nuclear weapons? And will the U.S. be more open to that idea, like in the case of Israel, which the U.S. considers partner and friend?
Sure, good question, and an issue that's been talked about a lot over the last several months, for sure. Of course, as a sovereign country, a democracy, Korea is a democracy. It has the right to make decisions for itself, including issues related to its defense that might include nuclear weapons at some point. That's their right. However, the U.S. would not support that. It's been our policy for as long as we've had nuclear weapons that we would not share them, convey them with third parties, the technology that goes into them, aside from some special cases in NATO involving the UK, France, and allies who developed nuclear weapons at the beginning of the Cold War. So we would not support it. There would be costs and consequences for Korea to pursue that track. Economic costs, breaking with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, would bring costs. So Korea would have to look very carefully at a decision to go that route. As an ally, we would be in a very difficult position. We would not be able to carve out any waivers or allow Korea to proceed if we were going to hold to our policy for the past 30, 40, 50 years. There's a lot of talk.
Of course, Mr. Rapson, the U.S. would not openly support South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons, but Israel secretly pursued nuclear weapons, and then U.S. found out later on, in which case the U.S. learned to live with nuclear Israel, which could also be the case with South Korea.
Well, there's one issue of learning to live with something that's de facto happened. There's another in supporting and allowing that to happen, as we did in 1975-76, when the Park Chung-hee administration moved clandestinely to develop its own nuclear capabilities. We pushed back very hard on that. And I think the same general approach would hold here. We would have hard conversations with the Korean government, reinforcing the fact that it's the alliance that brings the deterrence effect to bear, which helps guarantee the security and safety of South Korea vis-a-vis the North. So, nuclear weapons have been out there in certain political circles in Korea for a long time. It's resurfaced again.
Now, Mr. Rapson, I want to ask about the impact of the midterm elections on U.S. policy on North Korea. Although there are much races to be called, it appears the Republicans will take over the House with slim majority, more or less than they had expected initially. In which case, does it mean that President Biden's ability to conduct foreign policy will be less impacted than many people had anticipated before the elections?
I would agree with that. It seems that the so-called red wave, Republican red wave, has not happened. Votes are still being counted, of course, and the control over Congress has not been determined in the Senate or in the House yet, although the votes look like they will go in the direction of the Republicans for House control. But I don't see that having as much impact as feared just a few weeks ago, or last week even. And that's a question I got a lot when I was in Korea last week. What do you think the impact is going to be if the Republicans control both houses? And there's plenty of opportunity, if they do control both houses, to put pressures on the administration, budgetary pressures and others, to force or to influence adjustments, perhaps some adjustments in the administration's tack. But if it's only control of the House, I think the ability of the Republicans to do damage or to strongly influence the president are much diminished. And the president is still the president. He runs foreign policy, and I think he's committed to staying the course on North Korea, China, and the rest of his policies that he's laid out over the past 2 years.
Now, Mr. Klingner, Kevin McCarthy, House Republican leader, said he's going to run for the House Speaker. And back in 2017, he criticized the strategic patience policy as only allowing North Korea to vastly improve its nuclear and missile capabilities. Is it still the Republican view that the Biden administration's policy is somewhat similar to the strategic patience?
I think that's still the position of the Republican Party. I mean, that said, we've had North Korea continuing to expand and refine its nuclear and missile programs through every administration since the 1990s, if not before. So we saw large increase in North Korean capability and missile testing and a nuclear test during the Trump administration, and we've also seen the continuation of that trend under the Biden administration. So I think even if the red wave had occurred, I don't think there would have been much impact on U.S. policy. There's a very strong bicameral, bipartisan view of the need to be tough or firm or to enforce our laws on North Korea. And right now, there's no initiative by North Korea to accept diplomacy. So I think we are in a bit of a stalemate where we're going to continue to enhance our deterrence and defense capabilities while we continue to try diplomacy. But as long as North Korea refuses, that door is seemingly shut.
Mr. Rapson, we're in midway point of the Biden administration. This could be difficult for you because you were chargé d'affaires until July 2021 in the Biden administration. But how do you assess Biden administration's calibrated and practical approach? Did we see any results coming out of that? And did the Biden administration live up to its promise to put human rights at the center of its foreign policy when it comes to North Korea?
Which question to start with first? No, I think, of course, the new Biden administration had to deal with the current at the time government in Seoul, the Moon administration. I think they got off to a great start. They had a summit early on where many of these issues were covered, including the approach to North Korea and a reaffirmation of the alliance. There's a commitment to strengthen that, rejuvenate it, expand it. And the new Yoon administration, of course, has taken that to a new level with the Biden team, with the summit almost 1 year to the date later, May 21st. Where it's taking the relationship and the potential for broadening it to many new levels. Your question about human rights. Human rights ebbs and flows in administrations. Of course, Democratic administrations perhaps pressing human rights, making it a policy priority more so than the Republicans have. But we live in the real world. Events happen. Countries are forced to make decisions about those prioritizations given the needs of the moment or the foreseeable future. And that's where human rights bumps up against strategic security realities here. And it's just not possible for an administration as committed as one might be, like the Biden administration, rhetorically and in practice, to implement its human rights policy the way it wants.
First thing the U.S. government could do is name North Korea human rights envoy. You have to do it after 2 years.
Yeah, well, that seems to be a problem across the board within the administration. Congress has a little bit to do with it, or maybe a lot to do with it, but the administration has been slow in appointing ambassadors across a broad range of countries, let alone the human rights ambassador to North Korea. And we all know Bob King well. He did it for 8 years, bless his heart. That was a tough job, a thankless job in many respects, but he did it well. And why the administration has been unable to find a new envoy and appoint one is a question I have in my mind.
I feel like you haven't quite answered me. What tangible results did we see from practical, calibrated approach?
Well, there hasn't been a war on the peninsula. North Korea is in check, although it continues to expand and grow its arsenal, both of conventional and nuclear weaponry. And diplomacy hasn't taken off. The administration has not been prepared to take any additional steps on the diplomatic track to entice, incentivize North Korea back to the table. I know the administration has made a policy decision on that we will not offer anything to get them back. So, as Bruce said, we're at a stalemate. No progress, but only a deterioration in the balance of power in terms of nuclear and weaponry capabilities by the North in this standoff we now have. So, a glass half full, half empty, maybe.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Rapson, Mr. Klingner, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And happy Veterans Day.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.